Shribman was executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the former Washington bureau chief of the Boston Globe, and national political correspondent of the Wall Street Journal. A nationally syndicated columnist, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his writing on American political culture. He became a scholar in residence at Carnegie Mellon University in January, and in August will begin an appointment at McGill University in Montreal. Mr. Shribman was a regular panelist on the PBS show Washington Week, has appeared on both Face the Nation and Meet the Press, and is a frequent analyst for the BBC and the CBC. He has lectured at universities and colleges around the country and taught courses at Notre Dame, Brandeis, Virginia Commonwealth, and Gettysburg College. A summa cum laude graduate of Dartmouth College, Mr. Shribman is an emeritus member of the Board of Trustees of Dartmouth and of the Board of Visitors of Dartmouth's Rockefeller Center for Social Sciences. He is a member of the selection committee for the Profiles in Courage Award given by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and is chairman of the selection committee of the Elijah Parrish Lovejoy Award given by Colby College. He also sits on the national board of the Calvin Coolidge Foundation and holds 4 honorary degrees. Please welcome David Shribman.
Well, thank you very much. This is, I think, the 3rd or 4th time and I recognize some of you, that I've done this Vermont Humanities speeches. And I know you were worried about the weather, but last year when I did it in Newport, I was 2 hours late for my own speech. It's like being late for your own funeral. And so we did it on the next morning, so we don't have to do this. In the audience, this will mortify him, is my high school history teacher, Sandy Stephen, who's right there. And when both of us had black hair a long time ago, he inspired me to the kind of work I'm doing now, and I'm grateful to him. And he will remember that in high school, I was a terrible stutterer. And so I was hoping that none of you would show up tonight, in part because I do some speaking, a lot of speaking now, but I'm still scared when I do it. And also, if you hadn't shown up, I could have spent more time with these books back here. My mother, whom Sandy knew, said, sadly so many years ago, that she knew what she wanted to do for my 50th birthday, which was 15 years ago, that she was going to rent out the Boston Public Library and put me in there alone. You'll affirm, Sandy, I lived in Pittsburgh, have lived in Pittsburgh for the last 16 years, and grew to know a lot about August Wilson. Many of you know as a multiple Pulitzer Prize winning playwright who wrote 10 plays about Pittsburgh, and he didn't go to college and barely went to high school, but he was educated in a public library. And I live about a mile from the original Carnegie Library, where when I should have been working, I spent a lot of time. When editors are off doing mischief, they're usually having an affair. My secretary knew I was at the library. So I want to salute all of you for coming tonight on a night that might be a tough night to get home on. We can all camp out here. And mostly to salute the Athenaeum here for continuing the tradition of American public libraries, which has fostered so much great work and so much love among so many people. I love my library at home. My kids loved the library when they were growing up. And so the biggest thanks is to the library itself and to the institution of the library. So having given these talks before, I know that many of you really are here less to hear what I have to say than to hear what you have to say to me. So I'm going to give some brief remarks and then entertain what you have to say, and we'll have a conversation until around 8 o'clock when I have to scoot back toward the border and have dinner. My wife was supposed to be here, but she's teaching tonight, so she's a teacher and a professor. at the University of Pittsburgh, and so she is dealing with the selfless scholars there in Pittsburgh. So let me give a couple of prepared remarks, and then we'll talk a little bit about the topic at hand. I know all of you watched with great interest and affection the President of the United States last night. I know Vermont well enough to say that I can say that. So let me just say that of all the questions that the ascendancy of President Trump has raised, questions about the value of political experience in governing, on the fitness of business executives as government executives, or on the profile of the Republicans as defenders of the rich, the Democrats as the sentinels of the poor, none is more perplexing than the central question, what I think is the central question of the age, which is this: is there such a thing as the truth, and does the truth still matter? Now, this question has emerged repeatedly in the last 2 or 3 years. It emerged when President Trump, who has previously acknowledged that he was the guy at the center of the Access Hollywood videotape, said that he didn't make those comments at all. It resumed when he questioned whether Barack Obama, of course, was born in the United States, despite having acknowledged that President Obama actually was born in the United States. And in a speech, Mr. Trump, contradicting almost every analysis of his own tax bill, said the measure would hurt the wealthy, including himself. For nearly a half-century in journalism, from a hometown cub reporter to a national political correspondent to a Metro daily executive editor, I've navigated with the aid of a newspaperman's North Star, which is to say this: the conviction that there is such a thing as the objective truth that can be discovered and delivered through dispassionate hard work and passionate good faith, and that the product of that effort, if thoroughly documented, would be accepted as the truth. Mr. Trump has turned that accepted truth on its head, sowing doubts about the veracity of news reporting by promoting the notion that the mainstream media spews fake news. And employing an evocative, sinister phrase dating to the French Revolution and embraced by Lenin and his Soviet successors, particularly Stalin, he's declared that the great portions of the press are the enemy of the people. Now, much of the Trump rhetoric on the press, to be sure, is less statecraft than stagecraft, let's admit that, designed to dismiss negative stories as if the media had been never critical of past presidents, instead of the equal opportunity pugilists that we are. For we bedeviled Bill Clinton in the Monica Lewinsky episode and George W. Bush in the aftermath of the Iraq War. Even so, Mr. Trump can be credited with prompting, however inadvertently, the most profound period of press self-assessment in decades. And it comes at a period of unusual financial peril for all of us in the mainstream media. All around, there are sad affirmations of the diminishing credibility of the press, disheartening reminders that at least a third of the country, and perhaps even more, regards our work as meaningless, biased, or untruthful. In newsrooms, as at newsstands around the country, difficult but vital questions about the methods and motives of we in the press are being raised, forcing newsmongers and consumers of news alike to question our long-held assumptions. Not so long ago, Representative Tim Murphy, who's a Republican whose district includes the southern suburbs of Pittsburgh, told a closed-door fundraiser in the Tony Duquesne Club that our newspaper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, had specialized in fake news. Now, one of my sources called me while he was giving that speech, which is what I love, and he told me what the congressman had said. And so I, having the congressman's cell phone, called him immediately and told him that he owed me an apology, which he granted only reluctantly and not exactly immediately. 8 months later, our paper reported that this congressman, ardently anti-abortion, had sought to persuade his mistress to have an abortion. That's not, you don't see that every day, of course. He later resigned under pressure. So this sort of thing has become routine. The most prominent public relations officer in Pittsburgh told us that a perfectly benign and completely accurate story on his institution's activities was an example of fake news. Our police reporter repeatedly gets emails accusing her of producing fake news. Readers have called our high-tech writer and charged that she produced fake news. Now, I speak in the community, in communities like this all the time, and in the past year, the question of whether the Post-Gazette is a purveyor of fake news never fails to come up. It's almost always the first question. You don't have to ask it, because I'm going to answer it. This is my answer. In the 16 years I was executive editor of the Post-Gazette, we did not knowingly publish any story or any paragraph or any sentence or any word or even any syllable that we did not believe was true at the time. It's not that these kind of questions never emerged before. It's possible to assemble established facts and argue, for example, of the 906 bills passed by Congress from 1947 to 1949, and looking out on this crowd, I think you probably remember many of them, including the Taft-Hartley Act and the major reorganization of the armed services and the creation of the CIA, meant that Congress was very productive in that period. But it's also to arrange the exact same facts, or to pick some facts and to ignore others, to argue quite the opposite, as Harry Truman did in the 1948 presidential election, when in his politically potent rhetoric, he spoke of the do-nothing 80th Congress. During Watergate, Vice President Spiro Agnew, a favorite of mine, as I know is of yours, spoke of the nattering nabobs of negativism to attack the press that bit by bit was uncovering the truth of Richard Nixon's lies. I might add, parenthetically, that the person who wrote that speech was William Safire. This year, we had Kellyanne Conway, the counselor to the president, introducing the notion of alternative facts. Now, his phrase became an instant flashpoint, for almost no one seriously believed that provable facts have contradictory alternatives. There's no alternative to the fact, for example, that the Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. No alternative to the fact that the sun is 93 million miles from the Earth. There's no alternative to the fact that A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Nor is there any alternative to the fact that Mr. Trump's Inauguration Day crowd was smaller than Mr. Obama's. Though political figures often tell whoppers, and believe me, I've spent 30 years of my life with the political class, and they tell whoppers. It is incontrovertible. I mean, Bill Clinton said I never had sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. Though they often tell whoppers, it's incontrovertible that there is such a thing as the truth. The larger question remains, do people still care? Well, they should, and they need to. The human story is replete with examples of moments when the truth was traduced, or when the truth was obscured. The disputed reports about how the battleship Maine was sunk in 1898, the trumped-up conspiracy surrounding the 1933 bomb burning of the Reichstag that led to a brutal suspension of civil rights shortly after the Nazis took power in Germany. The false contention that the U-2 reconnaissance plane flown by Francis Gary Powers in 1960 wasn't engaged in espionage over the Soviet Union. The misleading claims about the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin episode that drew the United States ever deeper into Vietnam. The repeated obfuscations of the 1970s Watergate scandal, Bill Clinton's 1988 denials of a relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and the false belief that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003. Now, the president's taunts have produced long overdue, if uncomfortable and unwelcome reflection in my newsroom and every other one. This is an ancient question debated by scholars and theologians for centuries, potent and resilient enough to have been a topic to torture Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Bertrand Russell, Carl Bernstein, and Bob Woodward, and the international inspectors who searched for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It prompted Shakespeare in Othello to assign to Emilia the task of asserting, "I must needs report the truth." It prompted Gilbert and Sullivan in HMS Pinafore to have Buttercup sing, "Things are seldom what they seem, skim milk masquerades as cream." You're lucky I didn't sing that. But even though political figures often tell whoppers, it's incontrovertible that there is a thing called the truth. It's built on facts, one placed aside the other in a fair-minded way, not as partisan argument about just how effective was the 80th Congress or just how good were the Patriots last week, but as an exploration of how many runs the Yankees scored, or when the sun's in eclipse, or what happens at a meeting between the president's lawyer and a Russian lawyer. The truth may spawn debate, but veracity is never spawning debate. It may prompt passions, but itself is dispassionate. Indeed, the Hebrew word for truth is emet, containing the first, the middle, and the last letters of the alphabet, in effect saying that the truth is all-inclusive from A to Z. So what is left for us as journalists? It's left to us to show by our work that the truth still matters. I might well end these short remarks and begin to entertain your questions with reflections on the meaning and indispensability of truth as set forth in the book of Zechariah. There are things you shall do. Speak each man the truth to his neighbor. Give judgment in your gates for truth, justice, and peace. So there. That's the predicate for what I hope is a conversation, yeasty conversation among all of us about the truth and about the future of our country in this period, and about journalism, and about how to pay for journalism, and about why you can't get more than 10 stories for free from the Washington Post website. So I'm ready for your questions, and if they're really hard, of course I'll evade them. So, who wants to start? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if you think the cable news has caused some of these issues. They run a fine line between fact and opinion. Not so fine a line, maybe.
Right. Did everybody hear the question? Let me repeat the question. So I'll repeat the question. The question is about cable news. Does it skirt the lines of respectability and truth? And I think what you're asking is, does it wander from news reporting into commentary?
And is that part of the reason why people can't seem to tell the difference anymore?
And is that part of the reason why people can't tell the difference anymore? The question is a good one, and I wonder whether what you're asking about is the cause or the consequence of these other developments. But surely they work together in kind of like nature, one of those mutual reinforcing things. I'm a newspaper guy, and I very rarely watch TV and cable TV, in part because I have an aversion to facelifts, and I don't have time. But I recognize that it's a big force. But, I will just, as an aside, and I will promise you I'll get to the question. If you're going to spend a lot of time on Facebook and a lot of time watching cable news, you're going to spend no time back here in the stacks. And so I try to read the news once a day, and at night to read books, and at the gym to read magazines, thereby never losing a pound. But never missing the newspaper. I feel strongly about this. The rhythms of news have changed, and I promise I'll get back to this. The rhythms of news have changed, in which news comes as a cascade all day long. I'm old-fashioned enough to want to read the news once and then to read it again tomorrow. Now, that may seem like a suicidal work ethic for a newspaper editor. But, I walk around the newsroom all day. The TVs are on. I pick it up by osmosis. I have a wife who calls me an outrage about what just happened, no matter what, in the White House every day. So, I pretty much know what's going on. But I try to restrict my consumption of news to once a day. Then, again, that actually should disqualify me from choosing the front page for tomorrow's newspaper, which I did for 16 years. But nonetheless, I try to regulate as much as I can. I just see that someone's recording this. I should be much more careful. My pension will be revoked any minute. I think cable news has heightened the intensity of the conversation, but it's done something even more pernicious, I think. And it's divided us into viewers of CNN or MSNBC on the one hand, and on Fox News on the other. And if you watch MSNBC, you are not exposed to anything the president may or may not do positively. And if you only listen to Fox News, you're never going to, you'll never hear a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day at the White House. And so I think that's really dangerous. And, back when cable news wasn't as prominent, I used to say, you should read the National Review, which was William F. Buckley's magazine, and you should read the New Republic, which was Herbert Crowley and Walter Lippmann's magazine. And it won't necessarily be someplace in the middle, but at least you'll be exposed to thoughts that might not be congenial to you. I still think you should read the editorial page of the New York Times and the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. And I worked at the Wall Street Journal, where the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, which is very conservative, was constantly at war with those of us in the news department of the Wall Street Journal didn't necessarily share those conservative views. But the intellectual integrity of the journal's editorials was something to behold, and they're worth reading now. And they're more pro-Trump than they were during the campaign, but they're provocative and they're interesting. And the Times is completely the other way, so is the Boston Globe. I think exposing yourself to ideas that you don't like is the beginning of wisdom. And I don't think enough people do this. I know my wife's students at the University of Pittsburgh don't do this. I know my kids really do this. My kids who, I always say to them when they tell me they haven't read the paper, every molecule of food you have ever consumed, every thread of clothing you have ever worn, every gallon of gasoline you have ever wasted came from the newspaper business. Would you please look at the paper once in a while? And we'll talk about that a little bit too as we go, about young people and how they consume news. But so I'm worried about what you say, and I think it's a pernicious thing. Yeah. Yes. Now, what's the other end of it? I'm worried to think what the other end of journalism is. It's. Oh, I see. I thought it was anatomically repellent. Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to be a journalist. It was all newspapers, and it was a stable business. And I graduated just as the bottom was falling out of the market, 2008.
Oh, it's been falling. Boy, 2008, look at the golden years compared to now. Yeah, but good.
Well, yeah, I worked in the newspaper that for a while.
Which one? Which one?
I was at Newport Daily, and I worked for Chronicle and I did some work here with customers.
Okay.
Ended up going into marketing because I actually couldn't make a living in a newspaper. How much do you think the buyouts through the 90s and the early 2000s changed the way the newspaper business works? I actually worked with a lot of people who absolutely have no journalism degrees, barely have English understanding, and yet they're writing our news and they're editing.
Okay, so let me recast that slightly, and you are an editor. You can tell me whether I've done so fairly. I think what you're asking is whether less a question of buyouts and a question of staff reductions at newspapers and what effect they've had and whether it's been bad. Well, no newspaper editor wants his or her staff reduced, and I fought this for 16 years. Staff reductions were part of our daily or our annual or semi-annual reckoning. Every year, our paper usually loses $20 to $25 million a year. It's not really a great business model. It was my daughter who went to business school, not me, as you can tell. Although she works at a nonprofit and is the least paid member of her Stanford Business class, Stanford Business School class, of which I'm immensely proud. Actually, let me just say that she's the chief of staff of the San Francisco Symphony, and her demographics are even worse than ours. So, yes, of course, there are things we don't cover now. There are stories you don't read now. There are towns that have no one covering. There are state capitals where very few people work. Washington has not been severely affected because the Times now has 1,600 journalists, the most they ever had. It's with that in the paper today. The Wall Street Journal is robust. There's a lot of people running around Washington doing news reporting. But it's the towns and the state capitals we should worry. It's also investigations that aren't being conducted and beats that have disappeared. For example, when I went to the Post-Gazette in 2003, and the rule of thumb, of course, is that every editor thinks that the number of people he had the day he started is the ideal number. We had somebody who full-time covered child justice issues in the courts. No, we didn't write about that. Once she left, we didn't write about that probably for 8 or 10 years. We didn't abandon covering the Steelers, I can assure you that. Or the Pirates, the Penguins, or Pitt basketball, or Pitt football, but we did stop covering West Virginia University football and basketball. We did stop covering some of the small colleges, their sports. Our coverage of some industries was diminished. I'm very proud that in my 16 years I did not lay off one unionized journalist, not one. But nonetheless, our staff was not when I left as large as when I came, and I know exactly. I know there are things we don't cover. There are things that happen in our community that we are unaware of, and I worry about what would happen if there are further staff reductions. McClatchy chain, which once was a great chain, cut 10% of its news staff nationwide last month. It's not going in the right direction, except for the Times and the Journal and the Post and the Los Angeles Times. So I think the question's a good one, and the answer is terrifying. By the way, I never took a course in journalism either, so, yeah.
It seems to me that, at least in my interpretation, that the issue of credibility of news media, whether it's print or television or radio or whatever, is really not whether they're presenting fictitious facts. It's selection of facts and interpretation. And I think it's like...
Well, that was the example I gave with Truman, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And even ancient Greece, before anybody could hardly read and write, they considered rhetoric was an important issue. And rhetoric was if you could take the same set of facts and present an incontrovertible issue with a conclusion that was diametrically opposed one day, come back, take the same facts the next day, and wind up with a diametrically opposed, seemingly incontrovertible, and totally separate and opposite conclusion. And I think that's basically what happens in our legal system, where we have prosecutors and defendants. They have to all get all their facts out for the jury to assess, and then you build a story as to what happened. And the jury decides who has the most believable story. And I think the problem with news, taking the news to it, is too easy to select your facts or to select the interpretation or focus on certain facts more than others. And I think that's, to my point, that's where most issues of credibility come in.
I don't know who this gentleman is, but I hope he joins me on the podium next time I give this talk. That's a superb analysis. I would add one thing. I'd love to be able to paraphrase this, but it was not paraphrasable. I would add one thing. The selection of stories and the selection of what you assign your reporters to do is also a very important element here. You can, by not assigning another reporter to cover children in the social service system or in the justice system, we made a judgment that had ramifications that were not good. Now, there were no good choices in that case. There were never any good choices in this, but it's what you choose to cover and what you don't. And then there's a further conundrum that grows out of what you put on the front page and what you don't, which is why I insisted on every single day of the 16 years I was editor, executive editor, of approving the front page, because I felt that the front page was our statement of our values and our statement of how we saw the world today. And if you take a story about the president or the Congress or the Republicans or the Democrats and you put it on page A8 rather than A1, then you've made a judgment, and you have shaped the conversation of your community. And I often used to say that the job of an editor is to shape the conversation of a community, and that requires judgment. So what kind of judgment you exert is really the issue of whether of your editorship or of your role in the community. And my successor will have different values than I do, or different outlooks, and will not put certain stories on the front page. And I put a lot of sports on the front page because I felt it was an important part of the culture of Pittsburgh. I put a lot of arts on the front page because I felt that if we didn't support the arts, who would? And I put a lot of health on the front page because I know what the age of our readership is. Older than you. I know the figures. And let me just say one more thing in addition. Sadly, we printed a list of our readers every single day on the obituary page. Every one of those persons was one of our readers, and they're not being replaced.
Yes, sir.
One of the editors of Fox News and MSNBC, what do they think they're doing?
What do the editors of MSNBC and Fox think they're doing? I think they're looking at the ratings. I don't know. I mean, I was the editor in Pittsburgh, and I never saw the Mr. Rogers show, okay? So I'm uniquely unqualified to tell you what TV people do or think. I once, in 1984, was at the Iowa home show in Des Moines the week before the caucuses, and I ran into someone named Peter Jennings, and I said to him, "What do you do for a living?" That's the smart guy you invited here to give a speech. So I don't really know, and we didn't allow our kids to watch TV. It wasn't the case you could watch 2 hours a day. You could not watch television because we felt, well, you can imagine what we thought. Our kids, of course, watched TV at their friend's house, and they had ammunition for what every kid said, which is that we have the worst parents in town. I think that they're looking at ratings, and they're chasing ratings. I think that the CNN and MSNBC have seen that Trump all the time is good for their ratings, and I think Fox has made the same calculation. I think Fox calculated that becoming a conservative news outlet was good for business. I think the CNN made the opposite conclusion, and I think that they're chasing for ratings. Now, all of us in the print press, people always say to us, well, you'll sell a lot of newspapers. Well, nothing we do will sell a lot of newspapers. And in truth, the fact is, we sold more newspapers the day after Obama was elected than we did the day after the Steelers won the Super Bowl. So everything that you think about our circulation is probably wrong. It's a safe assumption that nothing we do will increase the circulation of newspapers. Yes, sir.
So do you see antidote for this? I mean, a significant portion of the population seems to be of the view that there is fake news out there, that there is the liberal media, the conservative media. Well, how do you turn that?
I don't know. I mean, this is what I'm doing tonight is one of the things I do to fight that. The question is, I'll say it in a way that you'll all conclude that I'm the big liberal. To paraphrase Lenin, what is to be done? What's the antidote, I think was the word the gentleman used. I give a lot of talks. I talk constantly, gave talks constantly in Pittsburgh. about this in churches and synagogues, everywhere, to kind of present what we do and to argue for our survival. I'm kind of an evangelist, not a television evangelist, sir, but just an evangelist. So my job, I thought, was half being an evangelist and half pastoral. And I don't know what else we do except to do the work we do. My friend Marty Barron, who is the editor of the Washington Post, was asked about this once, and he said, we're not doing something, what we're doing isn't pro-Trump or anti-Trump, what we're doing is our jobs. And I'm trying to make the argument that this is our job. The New York Times credo is to cover the world without fear or favor, regardless of any sector or interest involved. I can say with a straight face that I never rooted for any candidate to win or lose in my years covering, I think, 7 or 8 presidential elections or whatever. I did, when I was a congressional correspondent, I have to admit, I did root for one thing or another. Mostly I rooted that whatever happened before 5 o'clock so I could make my deadline. We really don't root. I covered Ronald Reagan, and I covered Michael Dukakis, and I didn't root for one or the other. We don't. We're professionals. We're proud of being court eunuchs. Second time I've used that phrase today. I think I better be careful. I do have 2 kids. We're proud of those professional standards. Now, of course, there are aberrations, and I had a woman come up to me in my first year and say, I want to ride the bus that was going from Pittsburgh to Washington to cover the abortion rights march. And I said, that's a great idea, but why don't you also plan on doing the anti-abortion rights march the same week? And she said, no, I don't want to do that. I said, well, no, we're not doing one without doing the other. I swear to you, we really believe in this. We're the last believers. We believe in the Constitution. We believe in the American system. We even believe in capitalism. We believe in the infield fly rule. We believe in this whole system, and we believe that we need to be fair. We believe this. Nobody believes we believe it, but we believe it. Yes, sir. I'll get to you next, I promise.
So if you believe in being fair, why doesn't the news speak to everyday heroes and present them as role models for people? Because I find the news pretty depressing, and I felt like the trend in that has continued. And the exposure of, I think, cable television in particular promotes the excesses of certain kinds of behaviors, and we don't have enough good people to believe it. There's a lot of good people in this room that could probably read a newspaper article, and they'll never be there because that, I've heard from other people in the news industry, well, that's not going to sell.
Well, first of all, I think the question is, why isn't there more good news? Why isn't there more celebration of local heroes, etc.? So let me address this in my own case. We have a big airport in Pittsburgh, and every day 150 or so flights land safely. We don't write about that. But should just one not land safely, we're all over it. Let's pray that we don't have to do that. We look at the world and try to decide how it's different today from yesterday. Sadly, the human experience often is negative. But, we instituted, no, not me, we instituted a column which is very, very popular in a paper called Random Acts of Kindness, in which people write in stories about what happened in some act of kindness. About 3/4 of them are people who had their wallets returned. or a lot of them are people from outside of town who were asked for directions to Heinz Field, and someone told them there, people picked them up and drove them there. We try to celebrate heroics, large and small. So let me just say that I live 3 blocks from the Tree of Life Synagogue, which many of you know was the scene of a horrific episode on a Saturday after October 26th. And in that, there were a lot of heroes. One of them the president noted yesterday. And so we tried to write about as many of those heroes as possible. And we tried to write about the horrific things that happened there also. And that was a very difficult balancing act. There were questions about whether we should write a story about the killer, because some people thought that that would just celebrate his act. I don't think there's one of you in this audience that would agree with that notion, that we had to write about the killer, which we did on the first day and the second day, and et cetera, et cetera. But we were very careful about how we did it, and we didn't want to feed into the notion that this person was looking for some kind of immortality and depriving other people of their lives. So we try very hard, but a lot of news is depressing, and we end up being sad sacks at the end of the day. We run 3.5 or 4 pages, and in the winter 5 pages of obituaries. We truly do run more in December and January than we do in June and July. And we try to do this, but I understand this critique, and I think it's merited. But think about the airplane thing I just mentioned to you.
I think it would be helpful to put some stats in the newspaper about how safe it is to fly.
Oh, we've done that. Everybody knows that there hasn't been a U.S. domestic air crash probably in 10 or 11 years.
But it'd be nice to do that every year.
Yeah, agreed. What would really be nice is every day to talk about how the stock market went up. That would be nice too, yeah. I promised you, yes.
I'm going to just try to articulate this, but before a story is presented in any medium to the mass audiences, be it like TV, news, whatever, can you briefly explain to me, because I'm not really sure how the industry works, but what is the system of facts? Is there a system of presentation of how the facts are checked before that's brought to the public and the industry?
You have asked the question that is the key to this whole thing. So let me paraphrase it. How do you guys decide what the facts are? Is there a process? And what do you guys do with those things? So let me admit that there is no process. That journalism is unlike being a historian or a physicist or a doctor, journalism is mostly like being a barber. I just thought of that, sis, but once you cut that hair off, you can't put it back on. Those of us who wear glasses always wonder, when we take our glasses off and at the barber, they say, well, is this okay? And you say, yeah, and then you put your glasses on and you don't know. So journalism is a sandwich or a series of tissues of trust. It's really quite remarkable. There's trust between the reader and the paper, or the viewer and the network. That's indisputable. There's trust between the source of the news and the reporter. And there's trust between the reporter and the editor. So what I'm saying is that there are fewer checks in this than you might find comfortable. But news reporters are experienced, and they have a sense of justice and a sense of professionalism. I never in my 16 years, and 26 years, because I ran the Washington Bureau of the Globe, in my 26 years as an editor, did I ever check out what one of my reporters wrote. because I hired them by and large, and I trusted them. Now that's dangerous, but we don't have the kind of staff where you can sit around and check the work of reporters. And we don't have that kind of time where that's possible, because we put those things on the web immediately or in the paper pretty fast. So when the trust breaks down, as it did with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or with any number of other episodes, it's a calamity. But as I said earlier, that we are the last believers. I believe in the people who work with me, and I believe in their sense of proportion and their sense of judgment and justice. Now, there are certain reporters who I think go off on a toot a little bit this way or that way. It's usually that way, not this way. And we watch carefully, and we kind of try to navigate them to the middle. Was kind of the paper's gyroscope. But I think you've identified the Achilles heel of journalism, with the exception of, say, Time Magazine and The New Yorker. We don't check our reporters, we trust our reporters, and if they screw up, we handle that issue, and then we always put a correction in the paper.
Can you talk a little bit about how Facebook, Twitter, and other engines like those have changed the nature of print journalism?
Yeah, how have Facebook and Twitter and all those other things changed the nature of print journalism? Well, first of all, we are obsessed with getting mentioned on Facebook and having those silly likes, and we promote our stories, not me, but others do, on Twitter. It's a means of communication. It has warped, surely it has warped our work a little bit, or should be shaped. I'll take advertising. There's a lesson from advertising in this. Wanamaker, which was the Philadelphia department store, Mr. Wanamaker used to say that he knew that half of the ads he bought were wasted, but he didn't know which half. Well, now we know which half. Now we can tell how many people read each story on the web. We can tell that somebody whose work we thought was wildly popular was in fact ignored by everyone. We know that some stories that cost a lot of money to do had only 50 readers. That's dangerous information to have, and yet it's indispensable information, because I would always say we will not stop covering the news the way we believe it should be covered just because no one read the story. Here's an example. The number of people who read stories about the symphony orchestra, well, there are more of you in this room, okay? Should we stop covering that? The Pittsburgh Symphony had a better record this year than the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we sent 5 people to every Steelers away game, okay? So what we cover is also a statement of our values. So I'm worried about too much information about how many people read stories. We made a decision that we were going to evaluate beats in which basically no one read the pages. Nobody reads recipes. They're online. We stopped running stock tables years ago because nobody looks at the paper. Nobody who actually actively trades looks at the paper for the stock reports. It's only a bunch of people, I'm afraid, my age and older, or your age and older, who still have 24 shares of AT&T. So we just run 30 most widely held stocks. Here's the question. Should we continue? Fortunately, I'm executive editor emeritus. This is not my problem. Should we continue to run box scores in the newspaper? They're the equivalent of a libretto in the opera. Those kind of questions. But you know, everything in the paper has a constituency. And if you cut, I'm the guy who cut half the comics. Believe me, life was not worth living the next week. To save a little money, we outsourced to to some kind of a outfit, I forget who it was, I'm gonna keep my eye on the clock here, somebody to produce a baseball page, which we ran on page 2 in this baseball season, that had all the standings and the major league leaders in hitting and RBIs and stuff, and all the box scores. Because really, you don't need to do that yourself. The Pirates are either 29 games out of first place or they're 29 games out. It's nothing that's not debatable. No bias comes into that. So why do we have to produce this ourselves? So I hired this group, okay? And I just got a lot of calls from people who really, I think the French expression is pissed off. Were really pissed off that the word Pittsburgh was not in uppercase letters in the standings. And furthermore, that the Central Division of the National League, in which the Pirates ordinarily occupy the second to last or last place, that the Central Division standings were not at the top, but were under the Eastern Division standings. And wasn't that an outrage? Anybody want to be a newspaper editor? That's nothing. How about the calls of people who got a wet paper today, or whose paper ended up in the bushes? Yeah, call David. Yeah, I want to ask the box score lady. Go ahead. What are the pressures and questions about PBS and NPR, and of course the very excellent Vermont Public Radio here? The threshold question is whether or how much federal support they should get. And that's the question for all voters to decide. If you're worried about that, you can take comfort that there's a Democratic Congress. The question is, I listened to CBC radio. In fact, I was on CBC this morning talking about the president, this morning and yesterday, talking about the president's remarks. And I think they do a fine job, but the question is, should the government have its own radio outfit? The Soviet government had one. That didn't work out so great. I've known a lot of people who work for PBS and NPR, and they've been of the highest quality. Cokie Roberts and Linda Wertheimer were in my time, because I competed against them covering Congress, and they were peerless in their sourcing. It helped, of course, that Cokie's father was the majority whip of the House, and that Lyndon Johnson went to her wedding. But Cokie Roberts is unassailable in integrity and intelligence, and so was Linda Wertheimer and all the people who worked on NPR when I competed against them on Capitol Hill. And when I competed against them on presidential campaigns, they always knew more or as much as we did. And the same goes with the PBS reporters. John Yang, who's on the NewsHour, is one of my very closest friends. We sat beside each other on the John Glenn campaign for an interminable 11 months. He is a person of great experience and great integrity and, of course, a great sense of humor. And he's, I would trust John. I would trust anything that John Yang said, and I would trust my children to John Yang. And so the same with my fabulous friend, the late Gwen Eiffel, whose brother was a college classmate of mine. And Gwen, who fought all these horrible battles as a black woman to cover politics, first Congress and then the White House and then presidential elections. There was no greater print reporter. She worked for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the New York Times, then to PBS, then Gwen. I used to be on Washington Week. I thought that was a great program. So I have the greatest confidence in that work. I think there's some philosophical questions that underlie government-supported, but But let's agree that those begging sessions are long enough to suggest that the government isn't giving them a whole lot of money. So I think they do a damn good job. Oh, I shouldn't say damn. Yeah.
Back to the Iraq War, I'm always puzzled about how on weapons of mass destruction, we had people who were experts at picking out the weapons, and they were over there taking care of them, destroying
Scott Ritter, yeah.
those people. And yet, the paper of record continually insisted that there were weapons of mass destruction.
Well, that's so. That is absolutely so. And let me repeat the question. I'll paraphrase it if you don't mind, sir. That how could it have been that the paper of record, which is a shorthand for the New York Times, could have promulgated the notion that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when plainly they were not, right? The McClatchy Bureau, I think at the time it was Knight Ritter, never bought that theory, never bought it for a minute. John Walcott, who had been a Wall Street Journal colleague of mine, was the bureau chief there, or the person who directed that coverage, I guess, and he didn't buy it for a minute. How could that have happened? Books have been written about that. I think I know how it happened, and I'll tell you privately later, because I'm not sure I know, and I don't want to promulgate a theory that may not be true to the detriment of the reputation of an individual. But I think I know how it happened, and it was indefensible and a tragedy. And the Times has acknowledged that. So I'm going to take only one more question because I haven't had dinner yet, and most of you have. Sandy Stephen. This was my high school history teacher.
Same age. We look the same age now, because I had a tough 16 years, but go ahead.
In selecting off-ed columns in the paper, you clearly slant the paper one way or another, it seems to me, unless you're being neutral, as you can be, and choosing the right wing, the left wing, and the neutral wing, whatever you want to call that. Is that fair to say that that's what you try to do as the editor of your paper?
I didn't plant this question. And as somebody who earns an infinitesimal amount of money with a nationally syndicated column, I have a stake in this question and its answer. So let me tell you a story none of you will believe, but I swear to you is the truth. When I became editor of the Post-Gazette, my predecessor had the editorial page and the op-ed page, plus the news department. And I thought that was inappropriate. And I'd come from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Boston Globe, where those functions were separate, and the same person was not involved in all of them, in more than one function there. So on my very first day, I went to the publisher and relinquished any interest and any role in the editorial page. I said I would not meet with the editorial board. I would not be involved in any endorsements, and I would take the further step, which none of you will believe, but is the honest to goodness truth, is that I will never read a Post-Gazette editorial. I kept that pledge, saved me at least 12 minutes a day, and a lot of grief. So Sandy, the answer to that question is a very good op-ed page should have competing views. They should not slant one way. Now, the New York Times does a pretty good job with that, although it's very rare to see a pro-Trump piece in there. But they do they're committed to diversity of views, generally speaking, and to diversity of the authors. I once was talking to the op-ed editor of the Times, and he said, "Do you know any good black female conservatives?" Because he wanted to get those kinds of voices in the paper. For many years, when I was still middle-aged, I used to say one of the reasons my family didn't go on fancy vacations was because what America didn't need was a middle-aged white moderate. And so I never sold as many columns as Cal Thomas or Tom Friedman or other people. But that's okay. We had Op-ed pages live on, they didn't always, but they today live on controversy and on spin. There was a time, and that all of us, many of us here remember, when the New York Times editorial page consisted of James Reston, Tom Wicker, and Russell Baker. Now that was a murderer's row of columnists, I have to say, but they were all devout centrists or center-left, but teeny bit. In fact, they were the purveyors of the conventional wisdom. They created the conventional wisdom. Before that was a phrase that was reviled because they wrote smart analysis. And I knew two of those men, and I worshiped them, and I tried to emulate them or be the next generation's version of that. And believe me, there was no commercial interest in that. And when I became nationally syndicated, the guy who owned the syndicate, which is the Universal Press Syndicate, which at the time had Mary McGrory, Doonesbury still has, Peanuts, etc. I said, I talked about this white middle-aged moderate thing, and he said, no, David, you don't understand. We're in the syndicate business. This is not about journalism. This is about commerce. Sobering, but true. Anyhow, I have to drive about 40 miles tonight, and you need to get home safely. And I just want to thank you all for coming and to say, oh, no, not yet. And to say that, you voted with your feet to show interest in our civic life, and I applaud and I'm grateful for it. And I can look over this crowd and know that all of you buy newspapers, and I'm grateful for that as well. So thanks very much.